My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sivasankar and Guru Piranyo, fellow Jnanis. I'm going to continue from where I left the last time. I'm just going to do a little bit of recap and then continue. And we're continuing the Katha Upanishad. And in this Upanishad, it's in this verse on page 92, it speaks about how this divine knowledge, how, is characterized in the context of, the chariot model, and how, we look at the body and, the whole aspect of our intellect, mind, in the context of a chariot. And I spoke about how the chariot is depicted. And in this Upanishad, it talks about how the Jivatma, the soul, to the master of the chariot, the body, the chariot, the buddhi is the discriminative power or the faculty, the charioteer, and the mind and the reins. So let me take you through this kind of a framework that is beautifully captured in the Upanishad. And I give a little bit more nuance on the different aspects of the chariot model. And I covered the first three aspects, so I'll quickly run through. And we show that there are 11 parts to the chariot, and we covered the first three. So the first two is actually what we call the object or the gross matter, which is the field of experience, then the mechanisms of experience, which will go a little bit more, and then the experiencer itself. So this whole chariot depicts our different personalities, from the physical body to the mind and to the jiva, the soul. So here I spoke about last week, the road is actually our the path that we travel, and the road has different conditions, and there are different rules, and we need to understand that conditions and the rules to be able to operate very well in this world. I also spoke about the body, the chariot. The chariot also is made out of matter and energy. It's a four-dimensional, it's built in the four-dimensional space, which is three-dimension space and time. It experiences birth and death, and it's constantly changing. But we need to keep the body well toned to live a happy and prosperous and healthy life. And that as the chariot has shock absorbers, we too have shock absorbers in our lives that helps us to dampen some of the shocks that we experience as we traverse in this journey. I also spoke about the senses. The senses are actually the horses, the 5 horses, and these are the karma indriyas and the jnana indriyas, the 5 sensory organs, the sight, taste, smell, touch, and hearing. And these two need to be well toned. Otherwise, if it runs in different direction, you'd see that it has an impact on our life. So again, it helps us to navigate through this terrain called life. And you see that, in our lives, we have, various, senses that helps guide us, helps us to experience this material world. If it's not well toned, we see that we don't get the full information and the full experience. So our senses need to be refined and also well toned. And this is what the Upanishad is explaining. Now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in terms of how the Upanishad captures. So you see that from the horses, there are strings or what we call reins, and that reins are somewhat like our neural pathway in our brains. So the brains is like matter, part of the body, but within that we have these neural transmitters where the sensory organs information is passed through our neural pathways, right? And that is how that it converts information into neural signal. What we see, it converts into neural signals. What we hear, all those are converted to neural signals, and they form, impressions in our mind, right? And it's presented to the driver, right? So the stronger, the deeper the neural pathways are, the more holistic and more subtle information that we are able to obtain and present to the driver. So our neurotransmitters are very important, and you see that on the right hand side, these are all the pathways in our brains, and we need to keep our brains healthy. We need to make sure that the neural pathways are strong and good. And we see that, one way to do this is that we have to live a healthy life, eat healthily. The healthy brains, gives rise to, the happy hormones and the neural pathways. And you see that when they are strong, it sends signals, and it keeps that brain very rejuvenated. So if we don't use our brains, you see that parts of our brains will start dying. So the neural path, one way to enhance our neural pathway is through introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation. So when the senses are experiencing something, it's passed through the neural pathways, and healthy neural pathway helps us to remember things properly, analyze, and all those things. As we age, sometimes the neural pathways starts degenerating, and we get forgetfulness, and we get a whole host of other mental challenges in our lives. So how Katha Upanisha here explains why we need to keep the neural pathways very healthy, right? The next one is actually the fifth one, is what we call the ego, or the consciousness, or the ahamkara. This is the mind senses bond. Remember that the senses are transmitting information through the neural pathway, and we see that there's a great hold by the driver. And the hold is really important because the hold actually keeps all our horses in tune, right? When you hold it properly, we know exactly which horse is transmitting what information, and collectively, all the five horses, the senses, gives us a collective perspective of our lives and our experiences. If the hold is not strong, the horses will run in different directions. So when the hold is very good, the horses know that they cannot run in different directions. They have to wait for the driver to give instructions. So again, we see that how strong we are able to hold our senses tells you how strong the mind is. If it is not strong, our mind gets, continuously disturbed and pulled in different directions. So we see that, while the neural pathway converts that information, it collectively creates the experience. And that's what is the foundation of our personality. And the link between the information and the knowledge and the material world is what we call software, our software, to be able to analyze and experience this. And I said earlier, if the bond is weak, that is, we lack the concentration, the mind is out of control, like the horse is out of control. If the horses run in different direction, the chariot will actually tumble. So the same thing, if our senses are running in different directions, we get confused, and sometimes we are unable to develop and progress. So the bond of that whole must be strong and concentrated. That means that the mind must be focused, and only through focused mind the horses can be managed. And if you hold it really well, you know the vibrations of every horse, and you know which horse is following your instructions and which horse is sometimes the horses emit signals. Some are disturbed, some are calm. In that same way, when we hold the reins very well, which is connected to our senses, we know which senses are working really well and which is not. So again, and that becomes the basis of our thoughts, right? And if we are able to control and discipline the senses, you see that our thoughts become more and more disciplined. So here, these Upanishads explaining the chariot model and how it reflects, our different parts of our body and our experience. The sixth one is actually our intellect. This intellect is essentially, here we see that the intellect, so the intellect is actually here the driver. And the driver here is actually the one that is able to introspect, contemplate, reflect, and meditate. So the intellect is now receiving all that information, and because the mind is very strong and holding, the intellect is able to be focused, concentrate, analyze, be able to discriminate between what is real and unreal, what is truthful and not truthful, what is permanent and what is impermanent, what is finite and what is infinite, what is mortal and what is immortal, what is fleeting and what is eternal. So it is able to discriminate between what is real and unreal. And also the intellect is able to acquire contemporary knowledge that is continuously changing, and eternal knowledge, that knowledge which does not change. And that which is not changing is what we call the truth. So again, we see that the intellect is really important for us to gather information, analyze, make sense of the information, and take the right decisions. So again, this is so important in the context of this chariot model. So here it is that we covered the case where the intellect is critical. Now, when the mind is not peaceful and focused and scattered all over, it is very difficult for the intellect to essentially progress further. So, and to be able to be sharp, to be able to make sense of the world, to be able to become creative and discover new things, including the world and itself. So this is the intellect. I'm going to continue with the next aspect is actually the conch. Right, we covered the intellect, and the conch is actually, if you see, the driver is holding the conch. And it's very interesting that why the conch is so important. What does the conch do? When you blow in the conch, it tells you that the kind of mood that the driver is in. If the conch is playing a very soft, melodious, the horses will know, okay, the driver is in this mood. But if the conch is played in such a way that you're getting ready for a battle, getting ready for something very active and dynamic, and the music will be toned in that way. When the conch is played, it releases that vibration, and that vibration is sent through the hold to the horses, and the horses know what they are supposed to do. If they're getting ready for battle, the horses get ready and it's ready to gallop. If the conch is blown in a more melodious and calm way through that hold, the horses know that this is calm and sublimity. They will be quiet and calm. So the conch is essentially in the hand, and it's a discipline, inspirational instructions, right? And then instructions or vibrations to the mind to keep focus. Be illumined. Ride the race of life in a dynamic way. So the conch actually signals, the state of the mind. It tells us, okay, be courageous, be strong, be, confident of what you're doing, right? So again, when that mind is emitting that vibration, or the conch, you see that the sound reverberates throughout to the horses and the senses to prepare, for this journey, whatever the journey is, whether it's a battle or a long journey or to be silent and calm. So again, you see that this is very important in sending the signal. I like some of these quotes here. It's actually preparing the mind. Is what Swami Vivekananda says, that mind is not a dustbin to keep anger, hatred, and jealousy, but it's a treasure box. It's a treasure box to keep love, happiness, and sweet memories. So if the conch does that, it is about love and happiness and good memories that is transmitted to the horses, and the same thing, you see the sublimity and calmness to our sensory. I like this quote by Plutarch, which is a very great philosopher, and he says that the mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be kindled. It is not the things you dump in there, but it's actually to light that fire, that illumination, that paranjodi, right? And again, Swami Vivekananda says that if the mind is intensely eager, everything can be accomplished. If you're really, really determined, enthusiastic, you will discover what you're looking for. Mountains can be crumbled into atoms, right? We can go and land ourselves on the moon. We can discover the beginning of the universe. We can discover everything about our sun and the millions of suns that are out there. So again, we see that this chariot model describes the state of the mind and the intellect-mind bond. I want to proceed on to this. We covered the seventh one. Now we're going into a little bit more deeper, right? It is the subconscious mind, and here it is actually now the instruction from the passenger. So there's something subconscious that is riding in us. You have the driver, the mind, but the subconscious is actually influencing the mind. And in this Upanishad, it says that the subconscious mind, where the instructions come from the passenger. Passenger, you know who the passenger is. So he says that the subconscious mind or the memory is called the chitta. Avatya is actually the unmanifested, devoid of form. That is formless within all of us. That is telling us, sometimes we call it insight, intuition, right? And it gives us, actually it is nothing but that passenger of the divinity. And it says very clearly, this is a subtle nature of our personality, which is what cosmic intelligence. It speaks about the individual intelligence, personalized intelligence, and the cosmic intelligence. So it's about getting that instruction from that cosmic intelligence. It is what gives us feeling and being conscious. Right? If this component is not within us, we would not feel nor be conscious. So interestingly, this subconscious mind is an interface between the self, which I'll describe later, and the intellect. The intellect gets inspiration, the intellect gets, subtle knowledge. All is from this subconscious mind, right? It says, so here it is that, in this silence, the mind might be noisy, but when the noise goes down, you see that you get absolute silence. And here, a beautiful saying by Jalaluddin Rumi that says that silence is the language of God. All else is a poor translation. So here it is, in the subconscious mind, everything is very silent, right? And Rumi goes on to say, your mind, this globe of awareness, is a starry universe. When you push off with your foot, 1,000 new roads become clear. When you slowly quieten down the noise in your mind, you discover that highway to infinity. And Swamiji says that in the flames of our tapas, of awareness, I attain my own self. So when the mind is quiet and you get that information from that instructor or that passenger that is always been silent but within all of us. And then you see that 1-8 is actually subconscious mind, the instruction from the passenger. But the question is that what is that instruction that is coming through, right? So here, this is the knowledge or the jnana. And in this scripture, it gives this notion of a bow and arrow, right? So here, the bow, all of you all know what a bow and arrow is. Bow is like the body, right? And the brain, this is the matter. It has to be steady and strong. The string in that bow is the intellect, the jnana. The arrow is that mind, which is sharp, and aim in the direction to the universal personality. So you have that body, you have that string, and you have that arrow, and you are focused. When you aim to the direction of the universal personality, Swamiji calls it big I, right? So the body, the senses, the mind, and intellect is in that one state with that self. He says that when that happens, the arrow that you are shooting, gets to the target. What is the target? The mind that is pristine, the mind that is unified, you see, and the mind that is infused with the jnana, right, becomes that Brahman, the Paramatma, right, the Paranjodi. And this is where the small I becomes the big I. So beautifully stated in this Katha Upanishad that, Rumi says it very nicely. I have been a seeker and I still am. But I stopped asking the books and the stars. I started listening to the teaching of my soul. So slowly, that instruction is telling you, don't worry about the outside. Focus within yourself. And when you discover within yourself, you discover everything. So here Mahan says beautifully that the divine wealth of knowledge was increased through this practice, right? Acquiring this instruction. Being merged in the superconscious state of knowledge, I revel in the bliss in my own temple. He says that, in Tamil, Ennul Nan Arindeen, I have experienced the divine self. So here he says that bow and arrow is like that steady focus. So it's somewhat like this, right? He says that it's also quite consistent with the Mundaka Upanishad, which says that holding the great bow of the Upanishad wisdom, the aspirant should fix the arrow of the mind, sharpen with meditation on its target. Target here is to be one, to be enlightened. He says, draw the string with full absorption, full concentration, and shoot at the target. Oh, my friend, remember the immutable eternal truth alone is the target. So if our body, our mind, our intellect, and with sacrifice and introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation, the mind realizes it is that eternal divine self. So this is coming from the Mundaka Upanishad, and you see that Katha Upanishad also says that same thing. So what is that knowledge? That knowledge is nothing but understanding that our material world is in multiple states, what I call multiplicity. All our five senses are in 5 dimensions, bringing different things in there. So multiple dimensions, right? The 5 senses are sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. They provide the information and knowledge about this material world. And in that process, we experience, when the mind interacts with this material world, we experience sukha and dukkha, niceties and also challenges. And this is the DNA of the small I. It goes through all this fluctuation. But one of the things we see is that for people, some people, the oscillation between Sukha Dukkha is so wide and big, high volatility. So concentration becomes very difficult, right? So they're unable to realize who they are, right? So it is difficult to attain peace. Without peace, the clarity is not there. Without the clarity, the ability to realize the self becomes very challenging. So here, sometimes they feel life is so bitter, and they permeate that throughout their lives and, lead to a destructive lifestyle, right? So here we see that the five senses that are sending different signals, right, can and be they're oscillating the sukha dukkha's, right? It has a particular frequency. And what we see is that as we transition to that, through meditation, the mind anchors on the primordial force, that Kundalini force or the life force in us. You see that the pathway to sublimity and quietude leads us to that divinity. So we transition from that state of multiplicity to duality to singularity and ultimately to that universal state. So as we intensify, we see that we transition from the small I to the big I. And you see in all that state, the frequency of the mind starts changing, right? Before it was just moving up and down, now slowly transitioning into a kind of a quietude state. So we call this the gamma waves, and you have a lot of multiplicity and sukha dukkha's. We call it the alpha waves, as our mind becomes more calmer and meditative, and we attain the delta waves when our mind is in that universal state. That's the instruction that the passenger is sending to the driver. How to transition from the multiplicity to the duality, to the singularity, and finally to the universality, right? So we see this happening, and what we say is that the hold of that bow and arrow is actually the hold of that passenger and the driver's bond. If it's very strong, the passenger and the driver has very strong relationship. So when that soul is one with the driver, you see that they're seamlessly integrated. So the self-intellect bond is critical for that mind to be blessed, anointed with that wisdom knowledge. Again, Rumi says beautifully here, I searched for God and found only myself. I searched for myself and only found God. So we see that that bond is so important, the bond between the guru and the disciple, the bond between divinity and our personality, right? When that bond is very strong, we see that knowledge transmission becomes so much more efficient and we are able to become illumined. So here it is that bond is so important, the guru-disciple, the divinity, the personality, linkage. And finally, I want to come to the passenger. Who is the passenger? The passenger is none other than the soul or the Atma, the transcendental, eternal, and universal personality that is sitting in our chariot. It's subtle, formless, and dimensionless. And this passenger, all of us carry, right? This is beautifully described in the Nankadol Mahan's I God book. It's also written as Prajnam Brahma. Consciousness is Brahman. Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. I am that one. I am the divinity. Tattvamasi, thou, that thou art. See, and the last one, Aham Atma Brahma. The self is the Brahman. So When one realizes that step 11, one realizes that I am that. Self is nothing but silence, the expansion of our state of our personality and consciousness, liberation from all the sugadukas, the torments and human being, and you become liberated. In that liberation, you attain that finality, that final truth. That's what self is about. That's what this Upanishad is teaching us. That's what this Jnanavalal Paranjyothi Mahan has been teaching us, and so many other teachers. So basically, the chariot model has 11 parts, and I walk through with you that gross matter, the experience, that object world that we live in. That is the first two. That is one form of our personality. Then there is this mechanism of experience. This is a more subtle personality that we have. Sometimes we call it the antakarana, the mind. This is step 3 right up to step 10. And finally, we also have another important personality that subject the jiva, the soul personality in all of us. So this is what that ordinary human beings would do. They'll try, they have a body, they have the bodily experience, 1 and 2, and then they slowly start trying to go to step 3, trying to understand what step 3 is, trying to understand and manage their senses, and then try to, strengthen their pathway. Not easy. Through meditation, they find it very difficult. And you see that as they go along, they can experience 1 and 2 and maybe 3 really well. 4, maybe as age, it becomes difficult. And as they progress, those remaining steps gets weaker and weaker and weaker until they cannot experience that experience of the subject. So God becomes an abstract concept. They are unable to cognize this divinity in its fullest form. So most people, when they are focused on the gross matter, it is very difficult for them to experience that divine personality, right? So here it is. So the climb becomes very difficult and many give up. Right? So what Mahans have shown is that, yes, the transition is so important, but when you work hard to experience it in the fullest form, you see that it is slightly different. They start off with that experience of the divinity. So they permeate the divinity in every facet of our lives. That divine divinity and that self and the intellect bond is very close. And it goes step by step. The divine experience is emanated throughout step 3 to step 10, including they see that object, gross matter, our body, as divine, as the temple that holds that divinity. Hence, it's divine. So we look after our body. We don't abuse our body, and so on. So you see that for a Mahan, they start off with that self, Nan Yar, Kadavul Yar. And that intensive search, they lead to Nan Kadavul. You see? And you see that attainment percolates throughout all the other personalities, our mind and our gross body. This is what I learned from the Katha Upanishad, it's trying to say, and this is what I learned from Jnanavalal Paranjyothi Mahan. So here beautifully Mahan states that seeking the inaccessible God by ceaseless subjective and inward search, I have realized within myself God in its entirety. In Tamil, Mahan used to say, எட்டாத தத்பரத்தை எட்டி எட்டி உட்புறமாய் உற்று உற்று நோக்க நோக்க இப்பரமும் அப்பரமும் ஏக பராபரமும் என்னுள் நான் அறிந்தேன். What he's saying is that journey of intensifying understanding that self and percolating that, of course he was in this state struggling, but the effort enabled him to discover that 11th step, that big I, And then he realized that everything is a manifestation of that big I. Ipparamum, apparamum, ega paraparamum, yenu nanarinde. So this is what Mahan explains the Katha Upanishad. This is exactly what the Katha Upanishad is telling us. So this is Mahan's quote. This is another great person that also, Mahan, spoke about this. Enlightenment or awakening is not the creation of a new state of affairs, but the recognition of what already is. So the enlightened state is there. It's been covered by all our distortions and material things and the Maya and all those things in our lives. The day we get rid of that, we realize, I am that. I got state. So again, Alan Watts says that enlightenment. Imagine going through a door, this great barrier, going through the door. When you get in and look back from the other side, you find out that there is no door. Right? When you go to that cell, we think there is something that we have to go through, third eye, all these things to get there. But once you get there, you realize that all this, the doors are not there. When the mind is able to squeeze in the minutest way from the noise to attain that silence, and it looks back and it says that actually even the door does not exist. Right? Everything is that silence thing. So here, Katha Upanishad, Lord Yama is explaining to Nachiketa this different personalities with a chariot example. Sandosha.